These are two very interesting readings to put together at the start of a new calendar year and at the start of a new academic term here at the university. Let me take both of them and just emphasize, just give a little background to two notions in each of them. First of all, that passage from the letter to the Hebrews, which centers on the figure of Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a very odd figure, but he apparently caught the attention of many people in the Hebrew tradition, because he appears in the Psalms as well as originally in the book of Genesis. And then the author of the letter to the Hebrews takes up the image. If you remember the story, the author of Hebrews refers to it briefly. There's a raiding party of some various chieftains into the land of Canaan, and they capture Lot, Abraham's nephew, and his family, and take them off into slavery. And Abraham gets his neighbors together, and they go off in pursuit of these raiders and defeat them in battle and rescue their captives, and are coming back with all of the stuff that the raiders had captured and were taking away with them. And on their way back home, they pass near the city of Salem, which is going to become eventually Jerusalem. It's the city of Jerusalem in its origins. And out comes the king of the city, Melchizedek, who offers a sacrifice of thanksgiving for Abraham's success. And what he offers is bread and wine. Very interesting. It's the only time we hear of an offering of bread and wine in the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures. With all of the descriptions of kinds of sacrifice, there's no description for a sacrifice of bread and wine. Obviously, for anybody in the Christian tradition, it immediately suggests the Eucharist. And Abraham, in gratitude to Melchizedek, gives him a tenth of all of the things that they've recovered from this raiding party. Well, now this really strikes the author of the letter to the Hebrews, and for several reasons. First of all, you remember that later on in the Mosaic law, you are to give to the temple, to the high priest, a tithe, a tenth of all you possess every year. Well, the author of the letter to the Hebrews looks back at what he reads in Genesis and says, it's almost as if Abraham is recognizing Melchizedek as being the high priest, because he gives him a tenth of everything. So there's a kind of recognition by Abraham that Melchizedek really is a very important figure. But what do we know about Melchizedek? Well, one of the things that's most striking about him is that there's nothing striking about him. We don't know anything about him. He's one of the comparatively few people who isn't described as so-and-so the son of such and such. We don't hear anything about who Melchizedek is the son of. We don't know anything about his origins, about his parentage. And he completely disappears from the story after this one encounter with Abraham on the way back from Abraham's success over the raiders. So we don't know where he ends up. We don't hear anything about his death. We don't know anything about him. He comes out of nowhere and he disappears into nowhere. He seems to have no origin. We don't hear anything about his birth or parentage. He seems to have no end. We don't hear anything about his death and destiny. Well, that really captures the imagination of the author of the letter to the Hebrews. That Melchizedek, who is, the literal meaning of his name, as the author points out, a righteous king, who's also the king of Jerusalem, the king of Salem, closely related to the Jewish word shalom, peace, the king of peace, the righteous priest, the righteous king who offers bread and wine, who comes out of nowhere and has no conclusion, has no end. Clearly, the author of the letter to the Hebrews thinks, a kind of foreshadowing of Jesus. Hold that in mind while we turn to the gospel passage. I've had occasion to mention before here at St. Mary's that I think different gospels become one's favorite at different points in one's life. For a very long time, John was my favorite gospel. John is the addiction of theologians. It's entirely typical that somebody who's theologically interested would have John as a favorite. Then for a long time it was Luke. But I must confess, now that I am in the shadier side of middle age, over the course of the academic break, I switched my vitamins to Centrum Silver. Life is coming to an end. Now that I am on the shadier side of middle age, I must confess that Mark has, for the last number of years, been my favorite of the four Gospels, for a lot of reasons, some of which you see in this passage. First of all, everything in Mark is speeded up. It is no accident that it's the shortest of the four Gospels. I wonder if it struck you, even in this passage we just read, Mark's favorite adverb, it shows up at least 36 times in the course of the scriptures, of the course of Mark, is the word that gets translated as immediately or at once. Immediately Jesus went into the temple, and at once the man came up to him, and immediately the Pharisees went out. Everything happens quickly in Mark. There's this sense of there's no stopping. Everything is one thing is piling on top of another. The second thing is, this is chapter 3 of Mark's Gospel. By the middle of chapter 3, notice that last line, the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians about how they could put him to death. By chapter 3, we've already got his opponents planning his death. No sooner does Jesus' mission begin than already the opposition is planning his death. Things happen at once, immediately. Also, Mark's Gospel it's almost as if Mark wants to get to the heart of the matter as quick as he can, immediately, at once. Let's not beat around the bush. Let's get right to the heart of this thing. Notice how, almost instantaneously, we don't hear anything about Jesus' descent. We don't hear anything about Jesus' birth. We don't hear anything about Jesus growing up. Immediately, we're plunged into the beginning of Jesus' public ministry when he's baptized. And almost instantaneously, we start getting stories about Jesus casting out devils. It's as if Mark wants to say, you know what this is really about? It is a confrontation between light and darkness, between good and evil. It's a confrontation between God and everything that opposes itself to God. And it's all happening now, at once, immediately. And it's all rushing to a conclusion. And you've got to decide where you stand on this. Which side are you on? Because there are no neutrals in this story. You're either with us or you're against us. You're for Jesus or you're opposed to him. Because the opposition starts right away. It's immensely confrontational gospel. There are no easy outs in Mark's Gospel. You can't decide to wait and think about it. It's now or never, because everything's happening immediately, and there are very stark contrasts. And the thing that Mark wants to insist upon is that Jesus is a kind of interruption of the normal course of things. In this chapter 3 of Mark's Gospel, which we've just read part, we heard a story on Monday and on Tuesday and now today. Notice the progression of the stories. On Monday, the Gospel story was, some people came to Jesus and said, why don't you teach your disciples when they ought to fast? After all, John taught his disciples when to fast, and the Pharisees teach people how to fast and when to fast. Why aren't you teaching your disciples how to fast? Notice what the question is. The question is, why aren't you like everybody else? You don't seem to fit any patterns. You're not like the Pharisees. You're not like John the Baptist and his disciples. You're something, you don't fit any of our preconceptions. You don't fit into any of the established slots. You don't fit into any of the categories. And then, yesterday, we heard the Pharisees furious at Jesus because Jesus allows people it would appear, to break the Sabbath. How can you do that? How can you break with the tradition of our ancestors? So today, they're waiting to see, since it's a Sabbath when he arrives at the synagogue, what's he going to do about this man with the withered hand? Is he or isn't he going to cure him? And if he cures him, isn't that working on the Sabbath? And isn't that a violation of the law? And Jesus, of course, heightens the whole thing, because there had been, for a very long time, in rabbinic circles, a discussion about whether God works on the Sabbath. Now, of course, Genesis says God doesn't. God finishes all the work of creation in 6 days, and on the Sabbath, God rests. But the Pharisees, or rather the rabbis, had also noticed the pretty obvious fact that some people are born on the Sabbath, and some people die on the Sabbath. So God seemed to be giving life and taking life on the Sabbath. Well, how is it that God can work on the Sabbath? And the conclusion was that, well, God's an exception. God can violate the law, since God is the lawgiver. God can work on the Sabbath. And that's what Jesus is after in this passage in Mark's Gospel. Tell me, is it wrong to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath? Is it wrong to give life, to cure life, to take life? The implication is, you let God do it. Well, if God can do it, so can I. Talk about a claim. No wonder the Pharisees are upset. That what Jesus is by implication claiming is that what God can do, I can do. Something brand new has happened. Something that doesn't fit any of the categories. Something that won't fit any of the established religious slots. That what has happened at the coming of Jesus of Nazareth is something brand new. There are no origins, and you don't know where it's going, like Melchizedek. I suggest to you that if we are going to be people of the new covenant, if we are going to be people who are genuine followers of the Lord, if we're going to be disciples in the tradition of Mark, then we have to be people who are prepared to find God operating in radically new ways. If we are going to insist that the way in which God works in our lives, the way in which God works in our world, has to conform to established patterns, has to fit pre-arranged slots, has to work neatly into our theological positions, has to coincide exactly with our doctrinal beliefs, has to work precisely according to canon law, has to deal exactly in the way in which the Church has always dealt with issues, then I suggest to you that we have a lot more in common with the Pharisees and the Herodians than we do with Mark or with the author of the letter to the Hebrews. That what we have to be prepared for is to let God be God, which means to let God surprise us. If everything matches the pattern, then we can be pretty sure that what we are worshiping is the pattern and not God. We have to be a people, both individually and as a community, who can deal with the surprising, the unexpected, the alarming, the unimagined, the previously unheard of, the never to be thought, the absolutely scandalous. If we cannot deal with that and be prepared possibly to discern the presence of God in it, then I suggest to you that when Mark insists, where do you stand, we may be standing with the critics rather than with the disciples. That's always an issue for the Church to consider. It's never more a time for the Church to consider it than our time. At a time when the Church is confronted with issues that it hasn't confronted in a long time, what do we do about the declining number of priests? What do we do about the declining number of religious, both women and men? How do we deal with a church that's clearly now a lay leadership-led church? How are we going to deal with that? If we're going to say, well, this is what the Council of Trent said, that's right. That's exactly what the Council of Trent said in the 16th century. You may have noticed it's not the 16th century any longer. This is what happened at Vatican I. Yeah, that's exactly what happened at Vatican I. But you may have noticed it's not the 19th century any longer. Well, at Vatican II, yes, God bless Vatican II. But you may have noticed it's not even the 20th century any longer. The fact is that we are confronting brand new challenges, and there may be brand new ways in which God calls us to move. And if we say, but we've never done it that way before, yes, that's only one of its advantages. The fact is that it may be that we need to think more creatively, more imaginatively, more bravely, more faithfully, more hopefully, and more lovingly than we've ever thought before. And you know what? If Mark were here, he would tell us, and you better do it right away. You better do it immediately, because there isn't much time. Mark has a lot to say to us still. It's the reason why he continues to be at present my favorite of the Gospels, because Mark continues to challenge. And if that's a little alarming, yeah, well, that's the way it goes, you know, when you're dealing with God.